Hello, and welcome to my super vlog. Today we'll be going more in depth on one of the 12 animation principles and my favorite one, which is squash and stretch. How can you include squash and stretch into an animation? Well, before we ask this question, let's first understand what squash and stretch truly is. Squash and stretch is basically making an object or character longer, flatter, thinner, or wider dependent on speed, mass, weight, or momentum. An example of this would be like a squishy bouncy ball versus a stiff solid ball. I'm going to quickly show an example that I made a while ago of a more stiff ball. These are all hand drawn so it doesn't look accurate, but as you can see, all of these balls are relatively the same and they don't have much squash and stretch in them, which makes it look more stiff, making the animation look like a rocky type ball going around. But if we move over to something like one of these animations, you can see as the ball falls through the sky, it gains speed, it squashes and it stretches when it's supposed to. If we quickly come over here and go to the keyframes, as it's speeding up, it stretches in, and once it hits the ground, it starts to squash, showing the effect that it is a squishy substance, and then it reforms just for the sake of the animation. We can also show this one more time with another example I made, where right before he starts to go, he squishes up and stretches as if he's gaining speed, blasting through the sky until he hits a rock. Back to this example, making sure that you don't overuse squash and stretch can also be important in the same sense. If you start stretching the ball from the frame it starts to fall, it wouldn't make much sense as stretching can be a form of showing the ball is picking up speed. So saving the stretch in this case would be better put a couple frames in where the ball is picking up speed. To show this example, if we were to start squishing it, instead of a couple frames in around right here, and we instead started squishing it as soon as it started falling, we wouldn't get that experience of it starting to squish midair or stretch midair before it goes to the squash. Whereas if we slowly bring in the stretch as it starts falling and gaining speed, it looks more cartoony and it looks more realistic depending on a squish. So in this case, we're in Blender. If we wanted to make this ball thinner, it is also good to make up for the volume by making it longer as well. And this can be shown like this. Whereas instead of having a ball that just squishes like this, it'll go to this. It just keeps the volume consistent, and it's good to keep this overall with your animation to keep consistent flow. Squash and stretch, although extremely important at times, is more common in things such as 2D art or very cartoony stylized games. This is mainly due to the fact that if you want to achieve a stretched or squashed out pose, you can just draw out the character in such way. For example, if we take Celeste, when Celeste jumps and she lands, you can see when she jumps up, she stretches upwards and also gets squished towards the squished inwards, becoming thinner. But when she falls on the ground, if we can pause this, you can see she actually becomes wider and she becomes smaller, making her more squashed. We can also see this when dying and respawning. If we pause in, that she's in the same position where she is more squashed down and she's a bit more wide to show that feeling that she's being squashed. And this is great for all these types of animations, including when jumping on a cloud. Gaining that little stretch in the air makes things a lot more clear and it makes it more cartoony style. But with 3D art, this becomes a bit more problematic. This is because in a 3D environment, the ability to change up a character or object's proportions is often defined based on how the skeleton or joints of a model are created. Although having such models and rigs are possible, they tend to use a larger chunk of memory and could potentially tank performances. This basically just means that this principle is more difficult to work with, making extreme squash and stretch far more difficult to achieve. This is why a lot of 3D games use more subtle squash and stretch, especially when going with a more realistic style. A thing to keep in mind though, is that even though it is less extreme in video games, that doesn't negate using squash and stretch. If we can see here, we have Multiverses. This isn't a realistic 3D game, as you can tell. It is more cartoony styled, especially using Adventure Time and Scooby-Doo in this case. When we jump as Jake, you can see a very clear stretch towards him. He becomes a lot larger, but he also becomes a lot thinner. And when he falls to the ground, you can also see that he has a very big squash while becoming wider. They like to include these little subtle squash and stretches within the walk as well. Harder to notice, but very subtly there. We can also see this with the attacks in the game, where when Jake does this little spiked attack, his body squishes downwards and then stretches out to extend his arm and smash around. Even if your rig isn't as complex to allow such effects, the character's movement in game can show off this principle by including exaggeration in compression and extension dependent on the poses the character is making. For example, instead of scaling, extension of things such as limbs during fast actions like jumps and lands or maybe attacks can go a long way. To conclude everything, squash and stretch can make your cartoony characters seem more appealing, and your more realistic characters feel more natural or lively. And when using it to exaggerate compression or extension of a character, it can make their poses feel more dynamic. In my personal opinion, I think squash and stretch is a huge part of the 12 principles of animation, and you can show and do so much with this principle. From 2D to 3D, there is always room to show such great use of this principle, and challenging yourself to make the best looking animation is always a great thing. Anyways, hope you enjoyed my super vlog on squash and stretch, and have a great day.